I watched the segment of Dr. Malone on Joe Rogan, and I heard him say those three blasphemous words: mass formation psychosis. And I've watched, politically speaking, I've watched the left deny that that exists, and I've watched the right regurgitate mass formation psychosis. But what I don't see people talking about is this SPI-B. I don't see them talking about the nudge unit. I don't see them talking about Yale University sponsoring an NIH study with the U.S. National Library of Medicine, where they literally said, and this was back in July of 2021, I believe, actually 2020, this was early on in the pandemic, where they said these are the methods by which to convince people to get in without showing them the evidence or proof that they're safe and effective. And they gave things like tell people they're not brave. They gave things like tell people that they don't want a robust economy, tell people that they don't believe in science, just the same standard talking points. So if you've got Yale University, you've got the NIH, you've got the American Medical Association, you've got 10 Downing Street, you've got in the UK and in the United States, open acknowledgement of psychological manipulation of reality. I personally think, Charlie, that even those three words, mass formation psychosis, I think that's been used as another form of psychological control to further pit people against each other to prevent them from figuring out what's going on. And I think that goes back to your question of why there seems to perceptually be a pivot to acknowledging these things. I don't think it's really a pivot to acknowledge them. I think it's a loosening of the noose, and we're witnessing a new psychological paradigm being constructed, another new normal within reoccurring new normals. I wanted to read you this. This is a quote from the New York Times on Tuesday, January 17th, I believe, or the 18th, which is Tuesday, but I think this is from the 17th, Monday. It says, the agency's director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, that's the CDC director, has sometimes skipped much of the traditional scientific review process, most recently in shortening the isolation period for infected Americans. It says now the contagious Omicron variant is pushing the CDC into uncharted territory because decisions must be made at a breakneck pace. The agency has issued recommendations based on what once would have been considered insufficient evidence, amid growing public concern about how these guidelines affect the economy and education. So they're openly, this is the New York Times, this is the CDC, they're openly acknowledging, and they're not now publishing recommendations, quote unquote, which have never been laws. They're just recommendations and guidelines on information that is not based on the scientific method. They're saying that directly. They've skipped the traditional scientific review process, and they're recommending things based off of, quote, insufficient evidence. Now, I mean, this is something that Charlie, you, myself, and so many others said 2 years ago. There was no basis for lockdowns. There was no basis for a 2-week quarantine. There was no basis for masks. There was no basis for any of this stuff. And we were told we were crazy. 2 years later, after all the trauma, all the terrorism, which is essentially what the UK government has acknowledged, they literally terrorized the public into accepting something that wasn't true. Now in the United States, we're starting to see the same thing happen. We're seeing, as you said, the media is starting to pivot. We're starting to see an acknowledgement that there is insufficient evidence, whether it's mass formation psychosis or it's something like the revelation of the method through Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and knowing what they were doing, not just with kids, but with breeding babies with women with Epstein's sperm. It's in the USA Today, in the New York Times, to create a race of super Epsteins, literally. And he was invested in cryogenics and artificial intelligence and robots and things like that as well. What happens, I think, is what we need to do is we need to be objective about everything that we see, because a lot of the times what we consider to be positive or consider to be us winning or consider to be, a doctor or a scientist, someone who becomes really popular, who's a big name in the so-called conspiracy or alternative community, a lot of times I think that's just counterintelligence. I think that's Pizzagate. I think that's QAnon. I think those are the same kind of a counterintelligence, Charlie, that Black Lives Matter and Antifa are. They're radicalized groups on one side or the other that are meant to divert our attention from things that we should actually be focused on. I don't mean that in some ambiguous, vague way. I just mean that in terms of what we are confronted with on a daily basis. Rather than picking a side and feeling like we're winning, we need to realize that that's part of the psychological game as well. Picking a side is part of the game. Don't pick a side. And I think this also, unfortunately, filters over into this concept of atheism, anarchy, and Satanism, which is big and popular today. People say, we don't like corporations. We don't like institutional religion. We're disenfranchised by it. We don't like spirituality. We've been, ripped off and harmed and traumatized by the church and these big institutions and governments. We want to overthrow the system. But ultimately, those people that believe in that, those institutions, the Satanic Temple, etc., they're propped up by, and they prop up corporations and big banks and governments. They prop up a form of scientific, what I call irrationality, that literally proposes that the scientific method can be used to explain away the spiritual world, when in fact the scientific process used to be based on explaining the physical world as an expression of the spirit world. So they're disconnecting the spirit and the soul. And why I call this ultimately satanic, and which is why I also don't think we should use that word and throw that word around like a lot of people do, particularly conservative Christians, is because Satanism as a form of belief, or what we might call devil worship, is an inversion of life. So when people promise, technocrats, the Elon Musks, the Ray Kurzweils, when they promise that we can obtain everlasting physical life, Charlie, we can obtain the elixir, the technological elixir of life, and live forever, ever. It sounds good because we don't actually have to have faith in anything. We don't have to do anything to acquire it. So we can just obtain that everlasting life. It's the deal that we make with the devil, which at the end of the day means that our soul is going to be eternally immersed in a physical world and confined to this crystallized material reality. So that is essentially the killing of the spirit and the trading of one's souls for material wealth, material gain, material life, etc., which won't even be that great because you'll be plugged into a sub-reality within ultimately a sub-reality. So I guess my point to all of this is the scientific rationale and the psychology urging and ushering and herding us into this scientific, technological, technocratic, transhumanist domain is really the Faustian agreement with the devil in a literal sense, because our soul is being traded for these things in the process. That, I think, is what is actually satanic about it, not just because there's a Baphomet statue. It's more philosophical and more symbolic than that.
I feel like how like when you're a minor, you're not allowed to enter into a legally binding contract because I feel like we are unqualified to enter into these contracts with these people that are trying to convince you to, like the Island Boys, those two guys, those two kids that were on Instagram rapping about everything. They look like sea monkeys. Yeah. Those guys, they came out, and like a week after they were like mega viral. One of the guys came out and said, yo, man, I sold my soul. I don't feel good. I feel bad. I shouldn't have done it. I was wanting money and all this stuff, and I sold my soul. And I'm watching this going, that looks like a guy that actually did sell his soul. Like, he looked completely hollow and empty on the inside. He looked like he just read the fine print of the contract that he signed. And
he already signed it in blood.
Oh, right. He signed it in blood in the altar in the record studio, right?